Hello, this is Elisa Rodriguez, and this is Arianism Today. Hope you're having a really good week. Today we're going to be looking at Micheal Hieser's The Jewish Trinity lecture, and we're going to be looking at and critiquing what he has to say. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely respect Dr. Hieser for his contribution, for his willingness to expound on this very divisive topic, and it's difficult to try to teach Trinitarians what he's trying to teach them. And what my aim is to clarify that what he's teaching is actually proofs of Arianism and not proofs of Trinitarianism. And so I like what he's teaching, I like what he's showing, but I don't like what it's being characterized as. And so that's where my gripe is. That's why I'm getting into that and talking about that emphatically. But everything that he's going to start looking into here on out is only going to be proofs for what Arianism is saying it is. And so for those of you who don't know what Arianism is Arianism is the belief that the Father is the only true God, that he is immortal, invisible, no one has ever seen him, no one has ever heard him, that God has used forever, or ever since he's had to contact his creation. Jesus has been the mediator between God and man. And since no one has ever heard or seen God, the only person who has had any kind of contact with God the Father is the Son, and the Son has come to reveal the Father to us, like John chapter 1 verse 18 says. And so in the Old Testament, every time they thought they saw God, the New Testament says no one has ever seen God. So it was the born God, or the only born God. John chapter 1 verse 18 says in the New American Standard, the only born God is the one who is revealing him. And so when they're calling this being God, or the Bible's calling this being God, it's because Jesus is a born God, but the only true God is the Father still. And so that's the concept of Arianism, and that's essentially what it's been. So the Father can be called God, Jesus can be called God. There is an illusion, or the view of being able to see more than one being, but they're never being said to be consubstantial. They're never being said that they're each other, or that they're one and the same. So if it's never said that they're one and the same being, then the inference of the doctrine of the Trinity is not there. It's not provided. And so that's my issue. I'm trying to show you that, well, actually, I want to let Dr. Hieser show you that there is proofs for the model that is Arianism, the model of there being two beings that can be called God in the Bible, and one being the only true God who is unseeable, and that there is this one God who is the Son of God, who is representing God to us. And so that has always been the case. That's always been the model. And I think Trinitarianism has the same model, that the Father is unseen, unbelieving, and that Jesus is the mediator, or the revealer of God and his will. And so we have to look at this in light of, the question you should ask yourself is this teaching Trinitarianism, or is this affirming Arianism? Arianism doesn't say that they're consubstantial, and Dr. Hieser is not going to get to the point to where he's going to prove that they're one and the same being. It's always going to be one representing the other. Never, biblically, will you ever hear that the Father was seen. Repeatedly in the New Testament, it says no one has ever seen God at any time, that God is immortal, invisible, the only wise God. There is so much implications in the Bible, that in the New Testament, that says that no one has ever seen God the Father, that the only one who's able to be seen is the mediator, is the image of God, the picture of God, and that's Jesus. And so in the Old Testament, anytime you see the theophanies, it's Jesus. And so, yes, you're going to see a plurality of divine beings, but you're not going to see consubstantiality. And so since you don't have consubstantiality, or them being one in the same substance, they're being connected together, being three in one being, since you don't have evidence of that in the Old Testament, then it never was the consubstantial idea. What the notion is, or what the attempt what's being attempted to be said is that this illusion, or the viewing of the two powers in heaven, is proof of the Trinity, when in actuality, since there's never a consubstantial communication, or it's never being represented as consubstantial, they must remain separate. And if they remain separate the entire time with never having any kind of consubstantial doctrine or evidence or insistence or direction from the Bible, then you have what Arianism looks like, which is two beings that are being called God. One is the only true God, like Jesus said out of his mouth in John chapter 17:3, and then the other being who is the only born God, who is the firstborn of all creation, the first thing to ever come into existence. God the Father, by his will, bringing the Son into existence. The Son not always existing, but coming into existence at a certain point in time. That's why the Father is the Father and the Son is the Son. If they were both co-eternal or whatever, then you would have the belief, then you would have not a father and a son, but brothers, if anything, relationally. So there's an issue there, even with the concept of father and son. If you're co-eternal or always existed and no one has ever come before the other, then they're just brothers. They're not father and son, but that's another topic. So that's what we're going to look at. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to watch Dr. Hieser and just go into the content.
It's like the next 2 weeks will be less interesting. But what we're gonna cover tonight is my favorite thing to do in lectures. This is my favorite topic because I think this is probably the most easily transferable component of the 4 weeks, at least in terms of importance, to someone who just hasn't had their head in all this stuff like I have. And that is something as centrally, fundamentally Christian, Christological, as an idea like the deity of Christ actually has very strong roots in the Old Testament. And I know you've had inklings of that before. You've probably read something or heard something about Jesus in the Old Testament and those sorts of things. But I'm going to show you tonight a number of places where, if you just have your senses sort of tuned to what you're looking at, I think you're going to be struck by the Godhead of the Old Testament. There's a two-ness that's very easy to see. We're going to go through how, for lack of a better term, binitarianism, how that's evident in the Old Testament. And I'm going to use that.
Okay, so he used the word binitarianism, which binitarianism or binitarianism is where you have two consubstantial beings. He said there's a duality there. There's like a two-ness to the Godhead, or to the Christology, or the divinity in the Old Testament, where there's a two-ness. And so remember what Arianism is, and what Arianism says, that there's two beings who are called God. One is the only true God. The other one is the only born God, being called God because he's the literal offspring of God. So therefore, if God has a son, if a human has a child, that child is a human. If God has a child, that child is God for all intents and purposes. So Jesus is the only born God because he's a unique in his own way, but he's still brought into existence by the will of the Father, just like everything else is. And so he says binitarianism, which is two consubstantial beings. He's saying that you can see a two-ness. Now, notice that there's not a threeness there, and notice that he's calling it binitarianism or two-ness, but he's not using the proper term for a two-ness in the Bible, which is Arianism. Arianism has, obviously, Jesus as the only born God and the Father as the only true God. So that is the doctrine of Arianism. Arius called Jesus the only born God, the Father the only true God. So it shows how that is what Arianism is, and this is what he's teaching. I mean, literally, he's using the word binitarianism and two-ness. When if you don't have the consubstantiality, though, if you don't have the language, or that if the Bible's not teaching you the consubstantiality of the two-ness, then they're actually just two different individuals. And so the assumption is that they're consubstantial, but you have to prove consubstantiality in the Old Testament. So all he can prove is the two-ness. And if all you have is two-ness without consubstantiality, then you really only have two, biblically. You're assuming Trinitarianism if you want to put binitarianism or consubstantiality to the two. But obviously in the whether they're joined in the same substance. So it's interesting because it's so close to Arianism. It's not even funny what he's teaching. So let's further this along.
To trickle over into 3. And then next week we're going to talk about how Jews before Jesus looked at what I'm going to show you tonight, and then also how Christians parse things, so you can get an idea of what the discussion was in the first century before the New Testament was even written about the Old Testament and a Godhead. Because that's what they were talking about. They were getting it somewhere prior to Jesus coming to earth, beginning his ministry, and prior to a New Testament ever even existing. And so the people that God used to write the New Testament, they're not just getting this out of the ether. It's not all new revelation. Okay, they're being taught either directly or directed, or they've had, in Paul's case, a lot of schooling. They're looking back at their Old Testament, and they're seeing Jesus in all sorts of ways. And this one is particularly important because of, again, the Christian idea that Jesus is God incarnate. So, with that in mind, let's jump in here and hope my...
While he's getting ready, I want to say that he's saying that the Jews and the New Testament writers all had a notion of two-ness, or what he's calling binitarianism, although there's no consubstantial thing going on there in the Jews, because then obviously they wouldn't be mono. They wouldn't have the Shema. They would be violating the Shema if there was more than one. But obviously others can be called God, so we can't skip over what he's already taught. He's taught that for the Jews, you need to prove or show that the word Elohim can be applied to other beings who are not the Almighty, like Jesus. And then once they get over that hump, then you start working towards building them towards the Trinity. Well, I absolutely agree. Everything that I've studied, I've seen that that Judaism has this Arian model where there's the invisible God, the unseen God, and then there's the God who reveals the unseen God. And that's Arianism in a nutshell. And so when you're seeing what he's talking about, it is literally Arianism to a T. Literally.
My thing works. If it doesn't, we'll just use the button. Let's use the button. Last week, just to review a little bit, by way of summary, the thoughts I wanted you to take away from the session was that divine plurality did not conflict with monotheism. And again, to a Jew, that was a big deal for obvious reasons. So that thought from last week, heading into this week when we get this Godhead idea, I'm hoping that you'll see that the Jewish mind, I mean, a Jew who was really concerned about his faith, that he or she could hear the claims of the apostles and hear this idea that Jesus was born of a virgin and he was God incarnate, that they had some place mentally to put that where it made sense. And they didn't feel that they were violating monotheism. We also said Yahweh was unique among Elohim. Now, we talked about Elohim last week, how the term was not attached to a set of attributes, and that's why the biblical writers could use it of a whole assortment of things. One of those Elohim was Yahweh, and he was, again, the phrase I like, he was species unique. There was none like him in terms of what he is and what he could do. Okay, and that's just standard Trinitarian theology. But what's different about it is I'm getting you to think about it in very more ancient terms than your New Testament. And the third thing that we mentioned was that one of the Elohim, besides Yahweh, I mentioned this at the very end, is going to get identified with Yahweh. Let me just say that again. One of the other Elohim, because one of the figures that Elohim could get applied to was an angel. One of the Elohim is going to get identified with Yahweh himself. Now, if you're following that trajectory, right away you have this feeling of, well, there's two, but they're sort of the same because they're identified with each other. And one of them is Yahweh, so the other one must in some sense be Yahweh as well. That's where we're going to camp tonight.
So really beautiful. I really like what he's teaching because this is exactly what I have been teaching. Honestly, when I listened to him, I really felt like this guy understands what I'm trying to say. So I'm not against what he's teaching, but you're just listening to him. You're hearing him say that there's this two-ness, and there's one Elohim, which is obviously the unbegotten, always existent, invisible Elohim. And then you have Yahweh, and then there's this other Elohim that gets identified with the other Elohim, and it looks like this one's a little bit special, and that they're together somehow, involved with each other. There's some kind of connection there. And I absolutely agree that happens. And I'll even go further to say, and he's trying to get there for us. He's trying to teach us and reach us to help us lead us into this path. It's the image of the invisible God. So Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so the reason why he's getting identified, like I said before in John chapter 1, verse 18, that no one has ever seen the invisible God, right? No one has ever seen God. In John chapter 1, verse 18, no one has ever seen God, the only born God, the only come into existence God, who is the Son, the born, begotten Son, God. He was revealing him. And so, yes, the Bible's going to show you illusions of where you see the Father, and then you see, there's a mixture there where you're seeing. And not a mixture of substances, but I'm saying there's a blurring of identities. I mean, the only reason that is because Jesus is a shaliah, which is a full representative. It's kind of like a lawyer. In law, in court, a lawyer speaks for you and defends you and can agree to things for you and has the authority to, that kind of stuff. The power of attorney, if you're sick, if you're on your deathbed and you have given the power of attorney for your own life, the decisions, to whether you live or die are in the hands of this person. You've given them the power over your own life. That's like the power of attorney. That's kind of the issue with Jesus, but it's more than that. He's representing his Father, which is a much more personalized issue. And so that's why Jesus is representing the invisible God. So we have to be able to see the invisible God and know that there is someone else who is representing the invisible God. And kind of like a prophet. You know, when a prophet says, "Thus saith the Lord," and then he starts talking in the first person as God, right? In a prophecy, when someone like a prophet says, "Thus saith the Lord," then starts talking in the first person as God in that prophecy. When that happens, that person is being a shaliach and is representing God by pretty much standing in his place and speaking out of his own mouth the very words of God for that moment. And so while he's speaking in the first person, he doesn't say God says this, God says that. It's I, the Lord, say this and that. It's in the first person, but you can't confuse the person who's speaking in first person with who God is. You have to recognize this is a prophet, he is a vessel of God, and that the words of God are coming out from this man, but this man isn't God, he's the mediator, he's the in-between. And so Jesus says, I only do what the Father tells me to do, I see what the Father does, I do what the Father does, I say only what the Father wants me to say. And so essentially, the role of Jesus is like a prophet, where everything he does is something that God's trying to get through to us. And so we have to hear that. And so, yeah, you're going to see this 1-2 invisible God, visible God, right? Uncreated God, begotten God, who's representing him, going back and forth in this kind of prophetic role. But it's even more than that. But to simplify, it's like a prophetic role. And so it kind of gets blurred, but only in the Shalia sense, not consubstantiality. So, but this is exactly where we're going into. Exactly Arianism.
So I showed you this slide.